Hello, my friends. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across the world, some lying in bed in the dark, others maybe sitting on a quiet train, or sipping tea in the late evening. All of you about to drift into a story. Tonight, we will travel together not to a fantasy land, but into the past, into the heart of France during the Second World War. What was it like to live under German occupation, not as a soldier or a general, but as an ordinary man? That is what we will explore. Our story begins with one man, Jean Moreau, a shopkeeper in a small French town not far from Chartres. He was not a soldier, not a politician, not a hero, at least not in the way history books write about heroes. He sold bread, wine, and candles. He lived in a narrow house above his shop with his wife, Marie, and their 2 children. When the Germans marched into his town in June 1940, Jean had no weapons to fight them, no way to resist. All he had was his family, his neighbors, and his daily life, which was about to change forever. The first time Jean saw a German soldier up close, he remembered the sound before the sight. Boots, dozens of them, hitting the cobblestones in rhythm, the kind of sound that could fill a street and press against your chest. Then came the motorcycles, the gray uniforms, the rifles hanging from shoulders. The children ran inside. The shopkeepers closed their shutters. But Jean stood at the window, half curious, half terrified, his heart thumping in his throat. The soldiers looked younger than he expected, barely older than his nephews. Yet they carried themselves with the cold confidence of men who knew they had already won. By the evening, posters had gone up across the town square. Curfews, regulations. Anyone found outside after dark without permission would be punished. Radios must be handed in, except for the official stations. The tricolor flags disappeared, replaced by swastikas on the mairie and the post office. Overnight, it felt as if the town had changed languages, changed faces, even changed its heartbeat. For Jean, the first days were filled with silence. People spoke in whispers. The baker's wife, who used to chatter about nothing, now lowered her eyes and said as little as possible. The men at the cafe no longer argued about politics or football. They barely spoke at all. Silence was safer. Every conversation might carry to the wrong ears. Every stranger could be listening. At home, Jean tried to act normal for his children. At supper, he sliced bread as if nothing were different. He laughed at little jokes. But when the children went to bed, he and Marie sat by the window in the dark, watching the patrols pass by. The soldiers moved like shadows with rifles, the metal parts glinting under the lamps. Jean would grip Marie's hand, and sometimes, though he did not want to admit it, he trembled. In those early weeks, the strangest thing was how quickly the extraordinary became ordinary. The first time he saw a German officer walk into his shop, Jean's stomach tightened as if he might be sick, but the officer only wanted cigarettes. He paid with occupation currency, smiled stiffly, and left. The second time it happened, Jean still felt uneasy, but he handed over the cigarettes with a steadier hand. By the third time, he barely blinked. What once seemed unbearable became routine. And that was perhaps the most frightening part, the way people learned to live with fear as if it were furniture in the room. One night, Jean heard voices outside his window. He peeked through the shutters and saw 2 German soldiers chatting with a young woman from the town. She laughed at something they said. One of the soldiers reached for her hand, and she did not pull away. Jean felt a knot in his chest. Was she flirting? Was she afraid? Or was it something else entirely? Hunger, desperation, the will to survive? He could not know. He only knew that the sight made his stomach twist, and he closed the shutters quickly, ashamed of looking. The next morning, he heard whispers at the bakery. People had seen the girl. They spoke of her as if she had betrayed them all, though no one knew what truly happened. In the occupation, rumors were as dangerous as bullets. A glance, a smile, a word, it could mark you forever. As summer deepened, the rhythm of life reshaped itself. The German presence was everywhere. At the station, at the market, outside the church on Sundays. Their trucks rattled through the streets, raising dust. Yet amid it all, people still tried to live. Children still played with marbles in the alleyways. Old men still smoked pipes on their porches. Life, no matter how tightly it was pressed by fear, kept pushing forward. And Jean tried to notice everything. Every sound, every whisper, every shift in the air. Because deep inside, he sensed that survival depended not just on bread or warmth, but on awareness. Who was speaking too loudly? Who had too much food? Who seemed too friendly with the occupiers? He stored away these details like coins, unsure when he might need them. At night, when the town lay under curfew and silence ruled the streets, Jean sometimes thought of Paris, of Marseille, of cities larger and farther away. What was happening there? Were people suffering in the same way or worse? Were they resisting? He had no answers, for the Germans controlled the flow of information. But in his heart, he carried a small, flickering hope that somewhere beyond the reach of those marching boots, someone was fighting back. And so the days passed, and the occupation settled like a heavy cloak on the town. Jean did not yet know the years that lay ahead, the hunger, the betrayals, the small victories and terrible losses. He only knew the sound of boots, the feel of silence, and the weight of uncertainty pressing down on his shoulders. That was the beginning, the first chapter of life under occupation. In the weeks that followed, the town became a place of strange contradictions. On the surface, life carried on. The market opened as always, though the stalls were half empty. The church bells still rang on Sundays. Children still darted through the streets, playing games with sticks and hoops. But underneath it all ran an undercurrent of tension, like the steady hum of a wire stretched too tight. Everyone felt it, though no one dared speak of it directly. Jean often found himself listening to footsteps more than to words. The measured stomp of German patrols, the quick shuffle of townspeople moving out of their way, the hurried creak of shutters closing at the first sign of danger. He realized that sounds had become a second language of survival. A door slammed too fast, it meant fear. A hushed voice in the alley, it meant secrets. Even silence itself carried weight. The heavy silence that fell whenever a German entered a shop or stood near the well. One afternoon, Jean watched as soldiers nailed a new notice to the wall of the mairie. The crowd gathered, pretending to read slowly, though in truth they were hungry for every word. The announcement declared new restrictions. Food rations reduced, curfew moved earlier, radios banned except for those tuned to official broadcasts. Anyone caught hiding a forbidden radio would be punished. The punishment, though not listed, was well understood. People whispered of arrests, of people taken in the night who never returned. That evening, Marie confessed that she could not bear to hand over their small radio. "It is our only way to hear the world," she said quietly, her hands trembling as she stirred a thin soup made from turnips and stale bread. Jean agreed but knew the risk. Together, they hid the radio beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen, covering it with a rug. From then on, every night after the children slept, Jean would lift the board, turn the dial as softly as possible, and lean close to hear the faint crackling voices from London. Sometimes the signal was strong, clear enough to bring news of battles far away. Other nights, it was only static. But even static felt like resistance. The scarcity of food became the rhythm of their days. Jean's shop shelves grew barer each week. Customers came in with ration cards. their eyes hollow, their voices tight with frustration. He could no longer sell freely. Everything was counted, measured, watched. Butter became a memory. Meat was a rarity, a luxury. Even bread was gray and heavy, mixed with whatever filler could stretch the flour. People began to whisper about the black market, secret exchanges in barns, back rooms, and hidden cellars. A man might trade a bottle of wine for a few eggs, or a pair of shoes for a piece of bacon. Jean, cautious by nature, avoided these dealings, but he knew others who did not. One of those was his neighbor, Claude, a wiry man with sharp eyes who always seemed to have a little more than everyone else. Connections? Claude would mutter, tapping the side of his nose, as if that explained everything. Jean suspected those connections reached both ways, perhaps to farmers who smuggled food, perhaps even to German officers who turned a blind eye in exchange for favors. Claude's family never seemed to go hungry, and that, in itself, made people watch him differently. Some envied him, others distrusted him. Jean, for his part, kept his distance. But not everyone had such means. Jean still remembered the night an old woman fainted in the square from hunger. People rushed to help her, but no one had much to give. He tore a piece from his own loaf and pressed it into her hands, though it meant less for his children. Later, Marie scolded him gently, not out of cruelty but out of worry. "We must survive, Jean. That is our first duty." He nodded, though the image of the woman's trembling fingers stayed with him. The occupation was not only about hunger and rules. It was also about uncertainty, about never knowing who could be trusted. Some men in town kept their heads down, pretending not to notice the Germans. Others grew too friendly, smiling, laughing, even drinking with the soldiers. These men were whispered about behind closed doors. Collaborators, traitors, but people spoke only in private, for accusations could be just as dangerous as guilt. Jean himself tried to walk a line of invisibility. He served soldiers in his shop when they came, but his politeness was stiff, never warm. He answered questions with as few words as possible. He avoided eye contact when he could. Yet every interaction left him uneasy, as if he were standing on a thin sheet of ice, unsure when it might crack. The children, too, learned new rules. His daughter, Elise, only 8 years old, once asked why they must turn off the lights so early, why they could not sing loudly in the evening as they used to. Jean knelt down, choosing his words carefully. "Because sometimes the night listens, my dear, and it is safer if we whisper." She nodded solemnly, far too young to understand, yet old enough to feel the weight of fear in her father's voice. And then came the first real shock, the arrest of Monsieur Bernard, the schoolteacher. He was a kind man, known for his gentle patience with children, for the way he told stories of history as if they were living things. One morning, German officers entered his classroom, marched him out in front of the students, and took him away. No explanation, no farewell. The desks sat empty that day, the chalkboard still filled with unfinished words. The children were silent, their faces pale. Parents whispered that Bernard had been caught listening to forbidden broadcasts, or perhaps writing letters to London. No one knew for sure. What everyone knew was that he was gone. For Jean, that moment pierced more deeply than any notice or ration. It showed that even the most ordinary, harmless man could vanish in an instant. It made the silence heavier, the whispers sharper, the sense of danger ever closer. And yet, life continued. The sun still rose over the fields. The river still flowed. The baker still opened his shop each dawn, though with smaller loaves each week. People still married, still buried their dead, still tried to hold on to fragments of normal life. This was the paradox of occupation. The world was collapsing, but daily life demanded persistence. At night, When Jean lay awake listening to the faint murmur of the radio beneath the floorboard, he often wondered how long it would last. Was this to be their life forever? Gray bread, whispered fears, the boots on the cobblestones? Or was this only the beginning of something larger, something that might one day end? He did not know, but he clung to the thought that beyond the silence of his small town, beyond the reach of the soldiers outside his door, the world was still turning, battles were still being fought, and perhaps, just perhaps, liberation would come. As autumn crept into the town, the first true test of survival revealed itself. Scarcity was no longer an inconvenience. It became a daily battle. Jean's shop shelves, once lined with wines, cheeses, and fragrant loaves, now stood almost bare. Wooden boards that once held bright fruits and rounds of cheese now displayed only a few pitiful items. Gray bread, turnips, jars of pickled vegetables that had been stretched and diluted until they were more water than flavor. Customers entered not with coins jingling in their pockets, but with ration cards clutched tightly in their hands, their eyes searching desperately for something, anything, that might ease the hollow ache in their stomachs. The ration cards themselves became a kind of second currency. A slip of paper could mean the difference between a meal and hunger. Each week, Jean stamped and recorded them carefully, aware that even the smallest mistake could draw suspicion. The Germans had their eyes everywhere, and food was one of the strongest leashes they held around the neck of the people. Jean noticed how hunger reshaped the rhythm of life. Conversations in the square turned to whispers about flour, about potatoes, about rumors of a farmer who had hidden pigs in the woods. Housewives traded recipes not for delicious meals but for survival. How to stretch a crust of bread into soup, how to brew coffee from roasted acorns, how to pretend chicory roots tasted like chocolate. Even children, once carefree, grew serious about food. Jean's son, Luke, only 12, asked questions no child should ask. How many more days until the ration card renews? Will we have enough for Christmas? Jean forced himself to answer with reassurance, though his heart ached with every lie. The market, once a lively place filled with shouts and laughter, transformed into a theater of quiet desperation. Women queued for hours for a small bundle of carrots or a lump of butter, often returning home with nothing at all. Sometimes fights broke out, sharp and sudden, when someone thought another had taken more than their share. Jean saw one man strike another over a single loaf, both of them gaunt, both ashamed when it was over. The occupation did not just starve the body, it starved dignity, too. The black market grew in shadow. Jean heard whispers of late-night gatherings in barns or abandoned houses, where men exchanged sacks of flour for jewelry, butter for silk scarves, a jar of jam for a pair of boots. These trades were dangerous. The Germans punished smugglers harshly, but hunger drove people into risk. Jean himself was tempted more than once. Marie urged caution, fearing discovery. Yet one night, when Elise fell ill and the doctor muttered that she needed more than broth to regain her strength, Jean made a choice. He followed Claude, his sharp-eyed neighbor, down a dark lane to a barn outside town. Inside, a single lantern burned, casting long shadows on the rough beams. Men whispered, exchanging bundles wrapped in cloth, glancing nervously at the door. Jean traded 2 bottles of wine he had hidden away for a small piece of cheese and half a chicken. The transaction was swift, his heart pounding louder than the sound of the coins. When he returned home, Marie's eyes filled with tears at the sight of the food. That night, Elise ate the broth made rich with chicken, and color returned to her cheeks. Jean felt both relief and guilt. Relief that his daughter ate, guilt that he had broken rules, risked exposure. But survival, he realized, was not clean. It was full of compromise. Winter deepened the crisis. The cold was merciless, biting at the town with icy fingers. Coal was rationed as strictly as bread. Families huddled in kitchens, the only rooms with enough warmth from the stoves. Windows frosted over and water froze in the buckets. Jean's children wore layers of patched clothing, sleeping under piles of blankets. Even so, they shivered at night. Hunger and cold became twin companions, pressing down on every household. The Germans, of course, lived differently. Their barracks were lit, their mess halls supplied with warm stews and coffee. Sometimes Jean caught the smell of meat drifting from the soldiers' quarters, a cruel reminder of the imbalance of power. To see abundance so near while one's own children cried with hunger was perhaps the sharpest wound of all. And yet, in the midst of this hardship, people found ways to resist despair. Jean remembered the evening when Marie gathered neighbors in their kitchen. She served a thin soup, more water than food, yet everyone shared it gratefully. Then, in a hushed voice, one of the men recited poetry, lines that spoke of France, of hope, of endurance. For a brief moment, the kitchen glowed not with heat but with spirit. Laughter rose, timid at first, then stronger. Hunger remained, but it felt smaller when carried together. Another night, Jean's son carved a toy from wood, an airplane, simple but precise. He handed it to his sister, who smiled and held it as if it were a treasure. In that small gesture, Jean saw the resilience of children, their ability to find joy in scraps and shadows. It humbled him, gave him strength to keep going. But not all moments were gentle. One bitter morning, a German patrol discovered a farmer with a hidden stash of potatoes. They dragged him into the square as a warning. The townspeople were forced to watch as he was beaten, his produce confiscated, his family left weeping. Jean stood among the crowd, holding Elisa's hand tightly. He wanted to look away, but he forced himself to see. To forget was dangerous. To remember was necessary. Afterward, whispers spread quickly. Some said the farmer had been betrayed by a neighbor, someone jealous or desperate. Others insisted the Germans had informants everywhere. No one knew the truth, but suspicion settled like frost. Eyes narrowed, trust thinned. The occupation not only starved the stomach, it poisoned the bonds between people. And still, Jean opened his shop each morning. Still, the bells of the church rang. Still, people queued in the market, whispered in the streets, clung to any scrap of hope. In their hunger, in their cold, they endured. Jean often thought, as he lay awake, of how strange it was that life could shrink so small, reduced to counting potatoes, to measuring scraps of bread, to bargaining for warmth. And yet, even in this shrinking, life found a way to breathe. His family was alive. His children still laughed sometimes. His wife still smiled, though faintly. And that, perhaps, was enough to keep going. By the time the first winter under occupation began to thaw, Jean noticed another hunger gnawing at the people of the town. Not just for food, but for truth. Information was rationed just as tightly as bread. What the Germans allowed to be spoken, printed, or broadcast was carefully designed to control the mind as much as the body. And so, the people learned to live in a fog, where truth and rumor tangled together, and one could never quite know which was which. Every morning, new posters appeared on the walls of the mairie and along the market square. Bold letters announced German victories. The Reich advances in Russia, England weakens. Resistance is futile. Photos of soldiers smiling with children or helping peasants suggested an image of order and kindness. But the people of the town had eyes of their own. They saw the hunger, the arrests, the fear. They knew the posters were lies, but lies could still wound, because they reminded everyone of the imbalance of power. Newspapers told the same story. The local paper, once filled with village news and debates, became a tool of propaganda. Jean would sometimes glance at the headlines while stacking shelves in his shop. Endless praise for the German army, endless insults toward Britain and America. But beneath the official words, there were whispers, tiny rebellions hidden in the margins. Someone would scrawl a mocking phrase across a poster, or leave a scrap of forbidden pamphlet tucked into a church pew. Small, dangerous gestures, but gestures that gave people courage. The radio was both the enemy's weapon and the people's lifeline. The official broadcasts blared in public spaces, monotone voices reciting news of victories that stretched across the map of Europe. But in kitchens and barns, in cellars and back rooms, hidden radios crackled with forbidden voices from London or even from Algiers. Jean and Marie clung to theirs like a relic. At night, they sat with the volume turned so low they had to lean inches from the speaker, straining to catch the English words. Sometimes, the broadcasts carried reports of Allied victories in Africa, or resistance movements striking back in small but daring ways. Each phrase was like a drop of water in a desert, too little to quench the thirst, but enough to keep hope alive. The danger was always present. Jean remembered the day the Germans raided a house 2 streets away. The family had been hiding a radio, and someone had betrayed them. Soldiers marched them into the street, the mother crying, the father silent, the children clutching one another. The family disappeared, and no one dared ask where they had gone. The radio was smashed in the square, its fragments left as a warning. Jean and Marie did not speak of it, but that night, when Jean lifted the floorboard to turn on their own hidden set, his hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped it. But if fear traveled through the air, so too did rumors. The town became a marketplace of whispers. One day, a farmer swore he had heard the Allies would land in France within the year. Another insisted that the Germans were retreating on the Eastern Front. Some rumors were hopeful, others bleak. Marie once returned from the market pale-faced, repeating that someone had said Paris was starving, that children there were fainting in the streets. Jean never knew what to believe. Perhaps none of it was true. Perhaps all of it was. Yet even lies had power, for they shaped the way people carried themselves, the way they hoped or despaired. Sometimes truth and fiction bled together in stranger ways. Jean recalled the story of the Phantom Airman, a rumor that swept the town one summer evening. People said an English pilot had been shot down nearby, but instead of being captured, he was hidden by villagers. Some claimed he had been seen walking at night, others that he left coded messages scratched into the walls of barns. Children whispered about him as if he were a ghost, a figure moving silently through the countryside. Jean doubted much of it, but the legend gave people something to cling to, a reminder that the enemy was not invincible. And then there was the matter of collaborationist propaganda, the radio speeches of Frenchmen who had chosen to side with Germany. These voices, smooth, persuasive, speaking in their own language, were perhaps the hardest to bear. They told the people that the occupation was for their own good, that Germany was building a new Europe, that Britain had abandoned them. Hearing a fellow Frenchman defend the occupiers felt like betrayal twice over. Jean would sometimes switch off the official broadcasts in disgust, staring into the shadows as anger simmered quietly in his chest. The children were not untouched by this battle for truth. At school, Elise was taught new songs, patriotic not for France but for the regime that now ruled them. She came home one afternoon singing one of these songs, innocent and proud of her clear voice. Jean froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Marie forced a smile and clapped along, but later, when the children slept, she whispered fiercely, "They are teaching her to love them. They are trying to take her from us." That night, Jean held Elise a little longer before she fell asleep, his heart heavy with fear that even his daughter's innocence could be reshaped by lies. But even propaganda had limits. People learned to read between the lines, to measure what was said against what was not. A German broadcast might declare victory, but if the victory sounded too loud, too exaggerated, the people suspected weakness. A silence on one front often spoke louder than triumph on another. Jean became skilled at this quiet reading, like a man navigating a river in the dark by the shape of the current. Still, the tension was exhausting. Every day felt like walking a tightrope of words, balancing between silence and speech, between knowing and pretending not to know. A single careless phrase at the market could mean a visit from the authorities. A single look of approval or disapproval could mark one as friend or foe. Even within families, people were careful. For who could be sure who listened at doors, who repeated what they overheard? And yet, amid this fog of lies, truth had a strange resilience. It seeped through cracks, whispered in kitchens, scribbled on scraps of paper, carried in secret radio waves across the night. Jean came to believe that truth was like a stubborn plant. Even if crushed, even if buried, it had a way of pushing through the soil again. He clung to that belief because without it, the fog would never lift and hope would wither entirely. As the occupation stretched on into its second year, Jean began to realize that the most dangerous battlefield was not always in the streets or forests, but in the hearts and minds of the people around him. Trust had become as scarce as flour. Every interaction, every smile, every friendly nod carried a question. Is this neighbor loyal to France or to the occupiers? Does this conversation risk a betrayal? Life under occupation turned simple relationships into a delicate, often perilous negotiation. Jean's family became his primary fortress against the storm. Marie, with her quiet resilience, maintained routines that anchored them. She still baked bread from the scraps they could spare, boiled turnips for soup, and tucked the children into bed with stories, sometimes of French legends, sometimes invented tales of heroes who outsmarted enemies. The children, Elise and Luc, learned early the value of observation. Who spoke too loudly, who lingered too long near a German soldier, which neighbors seemed to vanish at night. Their innocence was fragile, yet they adapted in small ways to the rhythm of fear. Neighbors, however, were a more complicated affair. There was Madame Fournier, whose husband had been taken in the first year of occupation and never returned. She carried grief openly but never let it harden into suspicion. Then there was Henri, a man who smiled easily at the soldiers and seemed to thrive under their notice. Jean kept his distance from Henri, wary of his motives. People like Henri were an uncomfortable reminder that survival sometimes meant compromise, and compromise sometimes meant betrayal, whether intentional or not. Food continued to dominate daily life, acting as both a bridge and a barrier between people. Jean had noticed that sharing could strengthen bonds. A loaf of bread divided with a neighbor, a handful of vegetables traded in secret, even a slice of cheese slipped into a child's pocket. Yet these exchanges were always shadowed by fear. If a neighbor gave too much, did it mean they wanted something in return, or worse, that they were under observation, sent to lure others into breaking the rules? Every act of generosity had its risk. The town had begun to fracture in small ways. Rumors about who was collaborating with the Germans spread quickly, whispered behind closed shutters. A woman had been overheard giving a soldier directions to a hidden barn. Whether out of fear or complicity, no one could say. Another man was rumored to be helping resistance fighters, though evidence was scarce. People learned to nod politely in public while keeping their true thoughts hidden, a silent code developing among those who wanted to survive intact. One evening, Jean observed something that crystallized the fragility of trust. Two men were speaking in low voices near the corner of the market. One, a quiet carpenter, leaned close to a German officer. The other, a baker, watched from across the street. A hand was passed, perhaps a note, perhaps a coin, and then the men separated. The carpenter went to his workshop, the officer walked away, and the baker returned to his oven. Jean did not know what had occurred. No one did, and yet everyone speculated. Stories were told in hushed tones, each retelling adding suspicion, fear, and uncertainty. Trust, once simple and natural, had become a currency more valuable and more dangerous than any ration card. Inside his own home, Jean struggled with smaller but equally profound tensions. His children sometimes asked questions he could not answer fully. "Papa, will the soldiers ever leave?" Elise would ask, her small hand gripping his sleeve. "Will we have bread again?" Luke asked one evening, holding a stub of candlelight over his homework. Jean gave answers that were partial truths at best, careful to instill hope without giving false guarantees. Marie often scolded him for not being firm, for letting worry seep into his tone, but Jean knew that fear had to be managed delicately. Too little caution could mean danger, too much could crush their spirits. Social gatherings had all but disappeared. Weddings were small, funerals muted. People avoided visiting each other except when absolutely necessary. Yet even in these restricted interactions, community endured in subtle ways. A neighbor might leave a basket of apples on a doorstep when no one was looking. A child might secretly deliver a note warning of an approaching patrol. Such acts, small and often unnoticed, were a quiet rebellion against the intrusion of fear and control. They reminded Jean that even in oppression, humanity could persist. And then there were the rare moments of unexpected kindness. One icy morning, a soldier knocked at Jean's door. His uniform was neat, his expression unreadable, but he asked if the family needed firewood. Jean hesitated, searching for a hidden threat. The soldier repeated the offer, and Jean, cautiously, accepted a small bundle. The gesture, simple as it was, became a story repeated quietly at dinner that evening, a reminder that human complexity could defy expectations. Some soldiers were cruel, some indifferent, and some unexpectedly considerate. Life, Jean realized, could never be reduced to simple categories. In these years of constrained survival, Jean also witnessed the small acts of courage that built a hidden network of resistance. A baker might leave a loaf out for a hidden family in need. A farmer might secretly divert vegetables to starving children. A schoolteacher might whisper lessons that defied the occupiers' propaganda. These gestures were small, almost imperceptible, yet collectively, they stitched the community together against fear, creating a fragile tapestry of human resilience. As winter slowly faded into spring, Jean reflected on the paradox of these times. The occupation had imposed fear, scarcity, and suspicion, yet it had also revealed extraordinary persistence, solidarity, and ingenuity among ordinary people. Every day was a lesson in adaptation. Every meal shared, every whispered warning, every quiet act of defiance became a thread connecting him to the world he longed to preserve for his children. And so, life continued, uneven, uncertain, but unbroken. Jean understood that survival was not only about ration cards and food, but about the delicate maintenance of trust, the courage to help others quietly, and the wisdom to read truth hidden among lies. The bonds within his family, and with those neighbors who had proven trustworthy, became his armor against the oppressive weight of the occupation. In a world where nothing could be taken for granted, even the simplest acts of human connection felt like small victories. By the second year of occupation, whispers of organized resistance began to trickle into Jean's small town. At first, they were nothing more than rumors, half-believed stories told in dimly lit kitchens or behind closed shutters. Villagers spoke cautiously, their voices low, their eyes flicking toward the street as if danger might emerge from the shadows at any moment. Yet even in these whispers, there was a spark, a sense that not all hope had been extinguished, that somewhere, courage was quietly gathering strength. Jean first encountered the resistance indirectly, in the quietest of ways. One evening, as he returned home from his shop, he noticed a young man crouched near the riverbank, scribbling words on a scrap of paper. The man's movements were tense, hurried. When he looked up, Jean met his eyes for a brief moment. There was recognition there, a silent understanding. Then the man vanished into the night, leaving only the faint smell of ink and the rustle of leaves. Jean could not know it then, but that scrap of paper contained instructions for a covert delivery of supplies to families hiding in the surrounding countryside. The first real sign of organized resistance came a few weeks later. Late at night, Marie awoke to the sound of soft knocks at their door. Jean, heart pounding, moved cautiously to open it. Outside stood two villagers, faces partially covered, hands trembling slightly. "We need your help," one whispered. "No one else can know. It is dangerous." They handed Jean a small bundle of bread and a note, urging him to deliver the food to a family living 3 miles outside town. The instructions were precise. Take the back roads, avoid the patrols, do not speak to anyone along the way. Jean hesitated, fear gnawing at his chest. To be caught aiding the resistance meant imprisonment or worse. Yet as he looked at the faces of the villagers and thought of his own children, he understood that moral courage was now as essential as physical survival. That night, he set out with the bundle, moving silently through the darkened streets, listening to the distant stomp of boots on cobblestones. Every shadow, every noise felt magnified. The smallest misstep could expose him. And yet, for the first time in months, he felt a surge of purpose, a flicker of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. Delivering the bread became a turning point. Jean witnessed firsthand the courage of others living under occupation. The family he reached, an elderly couple and their grandchildren, welcomed him with whispered gratitude, their eyes shining with relief. No words of politics or heroism were spoken. Their thanks were silent, expressed only in the trembling of hands and the relief in their faces. Jean returned home with a sense that even the smallest acts of defiance had meaning, rippling quietly through the lives of those around him. As weeks turned into months, Jean became increasingly aware of a network forming beneath the town's ordinary appearance. Messages were passed covertly in the market, in bakeries, through the pretense of routine errands. Children were sometimes used unknowingly as couriers, delivering notes hidden in bundles of food or tucked into schoolbooks. Each interaction carried risk, yet each interaction also carried the weight of survival and solidarity. One evening, a neighbor, Madame Fournier, approached Jean discreetly. She had been silent for months, her grief tucked behind closed doors. Yet now she whispered of a plan to shelter a downed Allied pilot. "He is injured," she said, eyes darting nervously toward the street. "We cannot do this alone." Jean understood the gravity immediately. This was no small act. It was defiance in its rawest form. The pilot's life would depend entirely on their secrecy and courage. To be discovered would mean death for all involved. And yet, the risk was outweighed by the necessity of action. The pilot arrived under cover of night, carried by 2 resistance members who had guided him from the countryside. He was young, barely older than Luke, and exhausted, his uniform torn, his face smeared with dirt and blood. Jean and Marie tended to him in the cramped kitchen, cleaning his wounds with water heated over the stove, offering what little food they could spare. The children watched from the corner, silent, absorbing the tension, the urgency, and the quiet bravery displayed by their parents. In these moments, Jean realized that resistance was not always about grand gestures or large-scale battles. Often it was quiet, measured, and deeply personal. It was about taking a risk for someone else, about protecting life when all around you seemed designed to destroy it. Each act carried immense danger, yet also immense meaning. Jean felt a sense of connection to a larger world beyond the small town, a sense that despite the occupation, humanity could not be entirely extinguished. However, the stakes of resistance were never far from the mind. A single careless word could undo weeks of careful planning. A shadow falling at the wrong moment, a patrol's unexpected route, a neighbor's unexpected visit. Any of these could turn safety into catastrophe. Jean learned to read the subtle cues of the town. Which streets were clear, which windows glowed at suspicious hours, which neighbors might be watching. Each night, he recalibrated, planning routes for deliveries, timing movements to the rhythm of patrols, constantly aware that the line between life and death was narrow and invisible. And yet, amid this tension, there was a sense of purpose that had been absent during the first months of occupation. Hunger, fear, and scarcity had dominated daily life. Yet now, there was action, subtle but profound. Jean and Marie discovered that even ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, could become part of a larger story. They learned that courage often hid in kitchens, in small back rooms, in the quiet choices to help without recognition. By the end of that winter, Jean had become part of the shadowy web of resistance, though not a leader, not a soldier, just a shopkeeper, a father, a husband, a man quietly learning to defy oppression in the smallest, most crucial ways. Each delivery, each hidden act, each whispered message was a thread weaving a fabric of defiance that stretched invisibly across the town. And through it all, Jean understood that survival was no longer merely about bread or warmth. It was about courage, morality, and the delicate balance of trust in a world that had been upended. The occupation continued, the rations remained small, the fear lingered, but within that fear, small sparks of resistance glimmered. Sparks that, if nurtured, could one day ignite into something larger, something unstoppable. As Jean became more involved in the quiet work of resistance, he learned, sometimes painfully, that courage and risk were inseparable from danger. The occupation had already taught him fear, but now he felt it in a new way, a creeping, persistent tension that threaded through every action, every decision, every interaction. One misstep could undo weeks of careful planning, and the stakes were no longer abstract. They were painfully real. It began with small warnings. The first was subtle. A shopkeeper from another street glanced at him a moment too long, a shadow in the corner of the marketplace that seemed to follow him. Jean tried to dismiss these feelings, attributing them to paranoia, to the natural caution that had taken root during the first years of occupation. Yet a deep sense of unease settled in his chest, a warning that the web of danger was closing in. The first betrayal arrived not from the Germans, but from someone he had trusted. Claude, the neighbor whose connections had once seemed convenient, now revealed himself as more opportunistic than loyal. Jean learned it in fragments. Whispered warnings from other villagers, fragments of overheard conversations, small acts that hinted at deeper treachery. One evening, he discovered that Claude had been providing information to the occupiers, not out of conviction, but for survival, for food, for safety. What had once seemed like cunning and resourcefulness now appeared as a dangerous, unpredictable threat. Jean felt a chilling realization. Danger did not always wear the uniform of the enemy. It could hide behind friendly faces, behind neighbors' polite smiles, behind the casual chatter at the market. Trust was fragile, easily broken, and sometimes false at the very core. Every interaction had to be measured, every word chosen carefully. The lines between friend and foe blurred, leaving a fog in which even familiar faces could be a source of peril. This lesson became painfully clear one night when a delivery of supplies to a family hiding in the countryside nearly ended in catastrophe. Jean had planned the route meticulously, avoiding main roads and German patrols. But midway, a shadow appeared among the trees, a figure moving silently, observing. Jean froze, heart hammering, until he realized the observer was a local man, ostensibly a neighbor. The man stepped forward and revealed he had been informed of Jean's movements by Claude, who had been trading information for small luxuries. The tension was suffocating, but Jean managed to defuse the situation with calm words and a promise of discretion. The family received their supplies, but Jean returned home shaken. He realized that betrayal could be as subtle as a glance or as devastating as a trap. Danger, however, was not only human. Nature itself became a challenge. The forest paths used for secret deliveries were slippery with rain, strewn with hidden roots and treacherous mud. On one journey, Jean slipped into a stream, soaking his clothes and ruining the small bundle of food he carried. The chill set into his bones, reminding him that survival required not just cunning and courage but resilience against the physical world. Every step carried potential harm, whether from human enemies or the indifferent cruelty of weather. Fear and betrayal also infiltrated the family's home. Elise and Luke sometimes spoke of neighbors or classmates in ways that revealed knowledge Jean could not ignore. One afternoon, Luke mentioned a boy at school whose father had openly greeted a German officer, speaking in ways that sounded suspicious. Jean's heart sank. How much could children safely know? How much could they unknowingly reveal? He realized that even innocence was vulnerable in this environment, that the walls of their home could not fully shield them from the creeping danger of betrayal. The resistance network itself was fragile. Plans had to be improvised constantly. Messages were passed through coded phrases, notes hidden in packages of food, or left under stones along familiar paths. Even then, the risk of interception was real. One night, a courier failed to deliver a note, and the family he intended to reach was left unaware of a German patrol scheduled to move through their area. Jean and other neighbors worked feverishly to warn them, improvising signals and diversions. The tension was a constant companion, pressing at every edge of their lives. Yet amid the fear and the betrayals, there were acts of extraordinary courage. The elderly couple Jean had delivered bread to months earlier began to take greater risks, guiding other hidden families to safety, relying on Jean and Marie to support their efforts. Children learned to move quietly, to watch without being seen, to carry small messages under the guise of play. Ordinary life and clandestine action intertwined, creating a delicate rhythm in which each person's choices could ripple outward with profound consequences. Jean himself became a careful observer of human behavior. He learned to read hesitation, to measure tone and gesture, to anticipate danger in ways that were both instinctive and deliberate. He began to understand that survival was not just about avoiding German patrols or rationing food. It was about navigating a web of human behavior, discerning loyalties, and constantly adapting to shifting circumstances. The lessons were harsh and exhausting, but they were vital. By the end of this period, Jean's world had grown both smaller and larger. Smaller because fear dictated the limits of movement and trust. Larger because he now perceived a web of connections, small resistances, and hidden acts of courage that stretched beyond the boundaries of his home and shop. Life under occupation was a careful balance of vigilance and action, fear and hope, caution and moral courage. Each day offered choices that could protect or endanger, and each choice left a mark on the fragile tapestry of survival. And in the quiet moments, when the children slept and the town seemed to hold its breath, Jean reflected on the paradox of his life. That danger and courage were inseparable, that betrayal and trust existed side by side, and that even in the shadow of oppression, ordinary people could perform acts of extraordinary bravery. The occupation had transformed his world, but it had also revealed the resilience of the human spirit, a resilience that would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. As the months passed, the occupation tightened its grip on the town. The Germans introduced new decrees, each designed to assert dominance, to restrict movement, and to make obedience a constant, visible reality. Posters appeared almost overnight, announcing curfews, ration changes, and regulations governing travel, trade, and behavior. Each announcement was more restrictive than the last, creating a sense that the walls of the town were closing in, suffocating both freedom and hope. Jean noticed the subtle changes immediately. The patrols on the streets were more frequent, more intimidating. Soldiers walked in pairs, their boots clanging loudly on cobblestones, eyes scanning windows, doors, and faces. Orders were shouted in German, then repeated in French, leaving no room for ambiguity. Even small infractions, someone out past curfew, a shop selling slightly more than its rationed allotment, were punished swiftly. Jean understood that these measures were intended not just to control food or movement, but to instill fear in every heart. Rationing became even stricter. The weekly allotment of bread, flour, and other essentials shrank further, and certain foods were now reserved exclusively for German personnel. Jean's shop, already meager in its offerings, became a place where scarcity was painfully visible. Customers pressed him for explanations, sometimes with anger, sometimes with quiet desperation. He could offer none, except to hand out what little he had and whisper reassurances that tasted hollow even to his own ears. Hunger, he realized, was now inseparable from the sense of oppression, a daily reminder that their lives were not entirely their own. The curfews changed the rhythm of life. Families had to adjust their routines, moving errands, deliveries, and social visits into the narrow windows allowed. Jean had to plan his shop's hours carefully, ensuring that he and Marie could still manage the household while adhering to the new restrictions. Even simple tasks, collecting water, visiting neighbors, or delivering supplies for the resistance, became exercises in timing, stealth, and careful observation. A misstep could mean a confrontation with soldiers or even arrest. Alongside the curfews came the mandatory identification checks. Citizens were required to carry papers proving their identity, their occupation, and their ration entitlements. Jean kept his documents meticulously organized, aware that a single misplaced paper could bring suspicion or interrogation. On one occasion, a young soldier entered his shop, inspecting cards and questioning customers. Jean's hands trembled slightly as he presented his own documents, trying to project calm. The soldier examined them, then left, giving a brief nod of acknowledgement. Jean exhaled, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly, though the constant threat remained. The changes were not limited to rules and patrols. Informants became more common. The town, already fractured by fear and suspicion, grew even more cautious. Conversations were hushed, greetings measured, and small acts of kindness became risky. Jean had long understood that trust could be dangerous, but now it had transformed into a careful, almost surgical awareness of who might observe or report. Even familiar neighbors could not be taken at face value. Despite the tightening control, the resistance continued its quiet work. Jean and Marie adapted, finding new ways to deliver supplies, exchange messages, and protect those in hiding. They learned to move with greater stealth, to signal each other using subtle cues, and to anticipate patrol routes with precision. Each successful action brought a small, private triumph, yet each failure or near miss reinforced the omnipresent risk. The line between bravery and recklessness became increasingly fine, and Jean's awareness of this balance sharpened with every passing day. New orders also affected children. Schools enforced German language lessons, strict behavior codes, and mandatory attendance, often introducing propaganda into the curriculum. Elise and Luke were learning to navigate a world where education itself could become a tool of control. Jean and Marie found themselves supplementing lessons at home, teaching French history, literature, and values in secret, striving to preserve a sense of identity and continuity for their children. These clandestine lessons became acts of quiet rebellion, small but crucial interventions to maintain culture and heritage under occupation. Trade and commerce, already fragile, suffered further. Deliveries from surrounding villages became rarer as roads were patrolled, fields requisitioned, and farmers redirected to serve German needs. Jean sometimes received rumors of families in distant towns starving because shipments of food had been intercepted or diverted. Each story reinforced the sense that survival was a precarious endeavor, dependent on caution, ingenuity, and occasional luck. Amid these pressures, the community found new ways to connect and resist in small gestures. A loaf of bread left discreetly on a doorstep, a whispered warning about patrols, or a coded note hidden under firewood all became acts of defiance. Jean saw that even as control intensified, human ingenuity and solidarity found ways to circumvent it, to preserve dignity, hope, and the bonds that made life bearable. Yet danger was never far away. One afternoon, a neighbor reported that a German officer had been seen questioning townspeople about resistance activity. Jean immediately altered his routines, delaying deliveries, rerouting paths, and communicating new signals to others in the network. The constant vigilance was exhausting, yet essential. Every day under intensified control required planning, patience, and courage. Through it all, Jean reflected on the paradox of life in the town. Every new order, every tightened restriction, and every patrol reinforced oppression, yet also revealed the resilience of ordinary people. Families, neighbors, and even children found ways to adapt, to protect one another, and to maintain some measure of dignity. Life had become a careful negotiation, balancing fear and courage, obedience and resistance, survival and principle. In this environment, Jean began to understand that the occupation was not merely a matter of rules, soldiers, or ration cards. It was a test of endurance, of moral judgment, and of human creativity. Every choice mattered, every action carried consequences, and even the smallest gestures of care, courage, or defiance had profound significance. With the arrival of stricter controls and new orders, the resistance became both more necessary and more dangerous. Jean quickly learned that the network was expanding, not through bold public acts, but through the quiet establishment of trust, the careful exchange of information, and the subtle orchestration of seemingly ordinary routines. Every act had to be deliberate, every word weighed against the risk of discovery. The first secret meeting he attended was in the cellar of an abandoned mill on the outskirts of town. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, and the room was dimly lit by a single lantern. A dozen men and women, most older or unremarkable in appearance, gathered in a circle. They spoke in whispers, passing notes, exchanging coded messages, and discussing small but vital operations: food deliveries, medical aid for wounded fighters, and warnings of German patrols. Jean felt both fear and exhilaration. Here, hidden beneath the ordinary world, was a quiet web of defiance, a network that was invisible to the occupiers but vital to the survival of countless lives. Marie remained cautious but resolute, supporting Jean while tending to the home and children. She too attended a few meetings, always careful to maintain her composure. Her presence provided strength to the group. She had a way of observing quietly, noticing small details others missed. Together, they began to understand that resistance was not about heroism or fame. It was about intelligence, discretion, and consistency. Even a minor lapse, forgetting a signal, misplacing a note, or speaking too loudly, could have catastrophic consequences. The growing network relied heavily on coded communication. Simple phrases carried multiple layers of meaning. A question about a child's health might indicate the location of a hidden family. A comment about a garden could signal an approaching patrol. Jean and Marie became adept at reading these subtleties, understanding the rhythm of coded language, and responding without hesitation. Each successful communication reinforced their confidence, but each failure or near miss reminded them of the ever-present danger. As the months progressed, the network became more organized. Routes for supply deliveries were meticulously mapped, meeting points were rotated frequently, and contingency plans were developed for every foreseeable scenario. Jean found himself relying on memory and instinct, recalling paths through woods, side streets, and hidden alleys that allowed them to avoid patrols. Every journey required careful timing, knowledge of terrain, and trust in those accompanying him. The stakes were high. A single error could compromise the entire network. The threat of betrayal remained. Claude, the opportunistic neighbor from earlier, continued to haunt Jean's thoughts. Rumors suggested that he had shared information with the Germans, yet it was unclear what exactly had been exposed. The possibility of betrayal forced Jean and the resistance to implement stricter protocols, limiting knowledge to only those who truly needed it. Even trusted members were vetted continuously, their loyalty observed through actions as much as words. Despite the ever-present danger, there were moments of profound humanity. One evening, after successfully delivering supplies to a hidden family, Jean returned home to find a small basket on their doorstep. Inside were fresh eggs, a piece of cheese, and a note written in simple, careful script. "For your courage and care, we see you." It was a reminder that acts of defiance were not only about survival, but also about the preservation of dignity and the bonds that kept the community alive. Children also played a subtle role in the network. Elise and Luke became keen observers, often tasked with carrying small messages or relaying observations under the guise of play. They learned quickly, understanding that silence and caution were as important as the messages themselves. Their education in resilience was unintentional but invaluable, preparing them for a world where courage often hid in the smallest of actions. The Germans, meanwhile, continued to impose a climate of fear. New patrols, surprise inspections, and random searches kept townspeople on edge. One night, soldiers arrived at Jean Street, demanding identification from everyone outdoors, questioning anyone who appeared suspicious. Jean's careful routines were tested, yet his composure and knowledge of hidden paths allowed him to avoid detection. The incident served as a reminder that vigilance was constant and that even routine tasks could become perilous. Through it all, the Resistance's purpose remained clear: to protect lives, preserve hope, and subtly undermine the occupiers' control. Each meeting, each delivery, each coded message was part of a larger pattern, a hidden thread of defiance woven into the ordinary life of the town. Jean recognized that the true strength of the network lay not in dramatic acts of sabotage, but in the cumulative power of small, persistent gestures performed by ordinary people who refused to surrender their humanity. By the end of that period, Jean felt both exhausted and invigorated. The network's growth was a source of hope, yet the weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon him. Every action carried consequences not only for himself and his family, but for the broader community. The occupation had turned ordinary life into a complex game of survival, strategy, and moral judgment. And in this precarious balance, Jean discovered a deeper understanding of courage. It was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. As spring deepened and the days grew longer, Jean looked at the town with a new awareness. Beneath its quiet streets, Hidden behind closed doors and under the watchful eyes of the occupiers, a network of defiance thrived. The web of trust, carefully nurtured, was fragile but enduring. It was a testament to the resilience of ordinary people who refused to be broken, who found ways to protect one another, and who clung to hope even in the shadow of fear. By the late spring of that year, Jean had become fully immersed in the covert world of resistance. Every trip through the town, every whispered exchange, every hidden delivery had honed his awareness. Yet despite experience and caution, the first truly dangerous situation arrived unexpectedly, shattering the fragile calm that had sustained him for months. It began with a courier who never arrived. Jean had sent a small package of food and notes to a family living on the edge of the forest, along one of the secret paths they had used repeatedly. When the scheduled hour passed, and no one returned with confirmation, unease settled over Jean like a heavy fog. He could not ignore the possibility that something had gone wrong, that the courier had been intercepted, or worse, that someone had betrayed the network. Jean set out cautiously, retracing the steps of the missing messenger. The forest, usually familiar and comforting in its shadows, now seemed alive with danger. Leaves whispered underfoot, branches scraped his shoulders, and every distant sound, a cracking twig, a rustle of animals, sent a spike of adrenaline through him. He relied on instinct and memory, recalling hidden markers and deviations that allowed couriers to avoid patrols. Each careful step reminded him that even in a place he had known for years, the ordinary had become perilous. It was near a small clearing that Jean discovered the first sign of real danger. The courier, huddled against a tree, pale and trembling, holding a note in one hand. The note was in the code they all used, and its message was simple but alarming. Patrol intercepted our path. Return immediately. Trust no one. The fear in the courier's eyes mirrored Jean's own. They had narrowly avoided detection, but the brush with discovery had demonstrated how fragile their security truly was. Jean led the courier back through a series of side paths and hidden alleys, avoiding the main road where patrols now moved unpredictably. Every glance over his shoulder revealed a potential threat. Every shadow could conceal a German soldier or an informant. By the time they returned to Jean's home, dusk had fallen, and the tension in his body had not yet released. The children, Elise and Luke, were waiting silently, sensing the gravity in their father's demeanor without understanding the full extent of the danger. The incident forced Jean and Marie to reassess their procedures. Routes were altered, new codes were devised, and meetings became more secretive. Trust had always been the foundation of their network, but now even the smallest miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. Jean realized that courage alone was insufficient. Meticulous planning, constant vigilance, and the ability to anticipate human behavior were equally vital. That same week, another challenge emerged, testing both Jean's composure and his sense of morality. A German officer began frequenting the marketplace with unusual scrutiny, asking questions about food shipments, deliveries, and local families. Villagers grew tense, their usual hesitations now sharpened into fear. Jean observed him carefully, noting patterns in his route, his mannerisms, and the questions he asked. Every interaction had to be carefully measured. Even a casual gesture could reveal too much. Meanwhile, Claude, the neighbor who had previously shown signs of opportunistic betrayal, reappeared in Jean's thoughts with troubling implications. Rumors suggested he had been providing information to the German officer, possibly identifying key members of the resistance. The mere possibility of exposure made Jean's every movement cautious. He became increasingly aware that danger could arise not only from soldiers and patrols, but also from those whom he had once considered neighbors, friends, or allies. Amid these threats, the resistance network adapted. Jean coordinated with other members to reroute deliveries, disguise notes, and create decoy paths. They used barns, abandoned homes, and even small caves along riverbanks to hide messages and supplies. Each adaptation required careful observation, precise timing, and the ability to predict patterns of both allies and enemies. The stakes had never been higher. Despite the tension, moments of human kindness continued to emerge, providing a fragile balance to the constant fear. Villagers offered food discreetly, shared news quietly, and protected one another in ways that went unnoticed by the occupiers. Jean came to understand that resistance was not only about secrecy and strategy, but also about the preservation of empathy, morality, and human connection under extraordinary circumstances. One evening, after ensuring a hidden family received their supplies safely, Jean paused to look at the town from a small hill. The streets were quiet, almost deceptively so, but he could sense the tension lurking beneath the surface. Each lighted window, each sound of movement, carried the potential for danger. Yet in that same moment, he felt the quiet pulse of resilience, the knowledge that ordinary people, despite fear, hunger, and oppression, continued to act with courage and compassion. The first major risk had left its mark. Jean's understanding of danger, trust, and morality had deepened, and he knew that each choice moving forward would carry consequences that could ripple through the community. Life under occupation was no longer just about survival. It was a continuous exercise in judgment, courage, and the quiet defiance that allowed ordinary people to protect one another, even when the world outside seemed determined to destroy them. In this delicate balance, Jean realized the true cost of resistance. Courage came at a price, and the margin for error was razor-thin. Yet even in the face of such peril, the network endured, sustained by determination, intelligence, and the shared understanding that human dignity, once preserved, could never be entirely extinguished.
As summer approached, Jean began to notice changes that went beyond the visible presence of soldiers and patrols. The town, which had once seemed merely tense under occupation, now vibrated with subtle unease. Neighbors whispered in corners, glances lingered a moment too long, and the familiar rhythms of daily life were punctuated by an ever-present sense of suspicion. It was a climate in which secrets carried weight, and one misstep could unravel everything. Jean had long known that the resistance relied on discretion and trust, but the first major brush with detection had revealed how easily these threads could fray. That summer, he learned that secrecy was not simply about avoiding the occupiers. It was about navigating a labyrinth of human motives, some loyal, some opportunistic, and some dangerously ambiguous. The first troubling sign came from a neighbor, a woman known for her quiet demeanor and careful observation. She approached Jean under the pretense of casual conversation, but her questions were pointed. "Have you seen anything unusual near the mill?" she asked, her voice low and wary. Jean understood immediately that she was probing, testing the boundaries of his knowledge. He answered carefully, offering nothing but the most innocuous details, while inwardly noting that vigilance would have to be heightened. Even the most seemingly harmless individuals could inadvertently, or intentionally, expose secrets that the resistance depended upon. A few days later, another incident brought this reality into sharp focus. A small child from the neighboring street had overheard part of a coded message and innocently repeated it at school. Though unintentional, the information could have compromised delivery routes, meeting points, and safe houses. Jean and Marie had to act swiftly, guiding the child to discretion without frightening him, while simultaneously reworking the network's communications to prevent future leaks. The incident served as a harsh reminder that information, even when partial or misheard, could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Meanwhile, the Germans continued their efforts to consolidate control. New officers arrived, bringing stricter enforcement and harsher penalties for infractions. Curfews were moved earlier, rationing grew more severe, and patrols became unpredictable, sometimes appearing multiple times a day in areas previously considered safe. The combination of increased surveillance and the risk of betrayal created an atmosphere in which every decision carried weight. Jean became acutely aware that success now depended not only on courage and skill but also on anticipation and foresight. Despite these pressures, the resistance network continued to expand. Jean began meeting with new members, carefully vetted individuals who could be trusted to carry out sensitive tasks. They shared information about German movements, coordinated hidden food supplies, and occasionally assisted families in relocating to safer areas. Each new member brought both opportunity and risk, as the potential for exposure increased with the size of the network. Jean learned to weigh loyalty, competence, and discretion with a careful eye, understanding that the smallest misjudgment could jeopardize everyone. One evening, Jean received a coded message that suggested a patrol was planning a sweep of the forest paths used by couriers. The warning was vague, yet urgent. He coordinated with other members to delay deliveries, reroute messages, and ensure that vulnerable families remained undetected. The tension was palpable. Every decision, every movement, had to account for both human error and German unpredictability. Jean's awareness of risk had sharpened to a near instinctual level. He could sense danger before it fully materialized, yet the weight of responsibility pressed on him with each passing hour. The strain of secrecy began to take a toll on the household. Elise and Luc sensed the tension in their parents' behavior, though they could not comprehend the full extent of the danger. Jean and Marie struggled to maintain normalcy, offering lessons, play, and warmth, even as their own minds remained focused on the delicate balance of resistance and survival. The house became a space of dual existence, ordinary life by day, strategic planning, and vigilance by night. Amid these pressures, subtle acts of human solidarity continued to emerge. Villagers discreetly shared food, offered safe shelter, or passed along information that could protect families from discovery. These acts, often unnoticed by the Germans, reinforced the sense that community and courage could survive even under the harshest conditions. Jean realized that resistance was not defined by grand gestures or spectacular confrontations. It was built from countless quiet, deliberate actions, each dependent on trust, observation, and moral resolve. Yet danger remained constant. Rumors of informants, patrol changes, and random searches circulated like a low, persistent hum. Jean understood that even a brief lapse in attention could have devastating consequences. He reinforced protocols within the network, ensuring that everyone knew what to do in emergencies, how to handle unexpected encounters, and how to maintain discretion in every interaction. Every detail mattered, and every act carried weight. By midsummer, Jean had come to accept the duality of life under occupation, a world in which fear and courage, risk and moral responsibility, danger and human connection coexisted in a delicate balance. The occupation tested not only survival skills but also the very character of those living under it. Jean understood that the network's endurance depended on careful judgment, unyielding vigilance, and the quiet, persistent courage of ordinary people who refused to surrender their humanity. And yet, even in the most tense moments, he could glimpse the resilience of life around him, children playing cautiously in alleyways, neighbors exchanging subtle signs of solidarity, families finding small ways to preserve dignity and hope. These glimpses were fleeting, fragile, yet profoundly sustaining. They reminded Jean that despite betrayal, danger, and oppression, the human spirit could endure, and that ordinary people could perform acts of extraordinary bravery without ever stepping into the spotlight.
As summer deepened, the rhythm of life under occupation became a delicate dance of observation, caution, and improvisation. Jean had grown adept at reading the town, anticipating patrols, and navigating the subtle web of threats and loyalties. Yet the arrival of new risks tested even his finely tuned instincts. The network's work had become increasingly complex, and with complexity came the ever-present danger of exposure. It began with a small, seemingly insignificant event. Jean noticed a new pattern in the market. A German officer lingering near the bakery, observing the townspeople with an intensity that suggested he was searching for more than bread. The officer's eyes followed subtle movements, the exchange of packages, the cautious glances of villagers, even the children's play. It was a chilling reminder that, in this environment, nothing went unnoticed. Every ordinary gesture could carry meaning. Every casual step could be interpreted as suspicious. Jean's network relied heavily on hidden messages, small bundles of information disguised as everyday objects. A folded note inside a loaf of bread, a mark on a fence post, a small scratch on a tree, all served as coded communication. That summer, these messages became essential, guiding the delivery of food, the relocation of vulnerable families, and the coordination of resistance activities. Each act required precision, timing, and the confidence that the coded language would not be misread or intercepted. One afternoon, as Jean transported a bundle along a familiar path, he noticed the first hint that something had changed. The forest seemed quieter than usual. Birds had fallen silent, and the usual rustle of small animals was absent. A sense of unease settled over him, a warning he had learned to heed. Halfway along the route, he spotted footprints that did not belong, heavy, deliberate, and too large to be local. German boots. His heart raced, and every sense sharpened. He signaled the courier to halt, crouching behind dense underbrush as the patrol passed a few meters away. The near miss left them shaken but unharmed, a stark reminder of the razor-thin margin between safety and disaster. The close call prompted a reassessment of their protocols. Routes were shifted, meeting points rotated, and signals refined. Every member of the network became more vigilant, understanding that a single lapse could compromise the safety of families, neighbors, and themselves. Jean realized that survival depended not merely on courage or caution, but on adaptability, ingenuity, and the ability to anticipate both human and environmental variables. Even as danger loomed, acts of human kindness persisted. Villagers, despite fear and scarcity, continued to assist one another. Small gestures, a loaf of bread left discreetly on a doorstep, a whispered warning about patrols, or a hand extended to guide a child safely through the streets, served as vital threads in the fragile fabric of resistance. Jean began to understand that these small, quiet acts, often unnoticed by outsiders, were among the most powerful tools for preserving life and morale. At home, Marie took on a critical role in maintaining the network's security. She oversaw the hidden storage of supplies, ensured that messages were prepared without error, and monitored the children's awareness. Elise and Luke, sensing tension in their parents, learned to move quietly, to observe without revealing too much, and to assist in subtle ways, such as carrying notes under the guise of play. The household became a microcosm of the larger resistance, a carefully balanced ecosystem of vigilance, courage, and human connection. The summer also brought a lesson in the fragility of trust. Jean discovered that Claude, the neighbor whose earlier actions had been questionable, had been seen near one of the hidden drop points. Though no harm was immediately evident, Jean realized that even those whose intentions seemed benign could inadvertently jeopardize operations. The incident prompted tighter vetting of participants, more discreet handoffs, and a heightened awareness that trust, once given, had to be continually earned and observed. By midsummer, Jean had become both cautious and strategic. Every movement was calculated, every encounter analyzed. The network's success relied not only on courage but on constant adaptation, improvisation, and the willingness to make quick, sometimes difficult decisions. Each narrow escape reinforced the understanding that survival depended on more than planning. It required instinct, calm under pressure, and the quiet determination to act even in the shadow of fear. Despite the persistent threats, the network's work continued. Families were fed, messages delivered, and those in hiding remained protected. Each successful operation was a testament to human resilience, a reminder that ordinary people could perform extraordinary acts without fanfare. The German presence remained imposing, yet the invisible network thrived, sustained by vigilance, courage, and the quiet defiance that Jean and others had cultivated over months of meticulous effort. As the sun set on the longest days of the year, Jean paused to observe the town from a hill. Smoke rose from chimneys, children's laughter echoed faintly through alleyways, and life, fragile yet persistent, continued. He understood that danger was constant, betrayal a looming possibility, yet amidst the fear, human connection, courage, and resilience endured. In this delicate balance, Jean found a quiet determination that even under occupation, ordinary people could protect one another, preserve hope, and keep the threads of humanity intact. As summer advanced, the oppressive heat mirrored the mounting tension in the town. Life under occupation was a constant negotiation between the visible and invisible, the ordinary and the dangerous. Jean and Marie had become highly attuned to these shifts, understanding that even a single careless step could compromise weeks of careful planning. The Germans intensified their presence in subtle ways. More officers were assigned to the town, each with different habits, temperaments, and obsessions. One patrolled the market daily, questioning shopkeepers and recording purchases. Another lingered near the riverbank, watching those who ventured too close to paths known for courier activity. Jean quickly learned to observe patterns, noting which officers were predictable and which were impulsive. Every detail mattered, from the angle of a soldier's gaze to the timing of a patrol's route. The network adapted accordingly. Drop points for supplies and messages shifted frequently. Couriers memorized alternative paths through fields, woods, and abandoned structures. Meetings moved from cellars to attics to barns, often under the guise of ordinary domestic activities. Every decision required a balance of speed, discretion, and judgment. A single misstep, an extra step on a stone, a misheard word, or an unexpected observer could trigger a cascade of consequences. One morning, Jean received a cryptic message delivered in the usual coded form. It suggested that a new risk had emerged. A local shopkeeper suspected of collaborating with the Germans might have observed a critical meeting. Jean understood immediately that the network's security had been compromised. He convened a small, discreet council with trusted members, and together they devised a strategy to protect both the families in hiding and the network itself. Routes were altered, information was compartmentalized, and each member's movements were closely monitored. Meanwhile, the human cost of occupation became increasingly evident. Families struggled under rationing, the heat, and the uncertainty of daily life. Children, though resilient, exhibited subtle signs of stress, restlessness, sudden tears, or silence when normally talkative. Jean and Marie worked tirelessly to maintain a sense of normalcy at home, balancing the covert demands of resistance with the needs of their children. Even small routines, reading aloud, teaching basic lessons, or preparing meals, became acts of resistance, preserving family cohesion under extraordinary pressure. The threat of betrayal continued to loom. Claude, the opportunistic neighbor, remained a source of unease. Jean observed him discreetly, noting interactions, movements, and rumors. Though nothing directly incriminated Claude at that moment, the awareness of his presence created a persistent undercurrent of tension. Trust, Jean realized, was never static. It had to be continually assessed, tested, and maintained. Even familiar faces could harbor unforeseen risks. The forest, a refuge and a pathway for couriers, became a place of both opportunity and danger. Patrols occasionally moved through at night, forcing couriers to improvise paths over rough terrain, through mud, streams, and dense undergrowth. Jean and other members learned to move with stealth and precision, using sounds, shadows, and timing to avoid detection. Every successful journey reinforced confidence, yet each narrow escape reminded them that luck, caution, and skill were inseparable from survival. Acts of solidarity continued to sustain morale. Villagers discreetly shared resources, guided families through safer routes, and provided cover stories for those under observation. Jean began to see that these subtle gestures, often unnoticed by outsiders, were the true backbone of the resistance. Courage was not only in overt defiance, but in these quiet, deliberate acts that kept hope alive. Despite these small victories, danger persisted in unexpected ways. One evening, as Jean moved a package of supplies through the market, he noticed a child watching him intently, curiosity evident in his gaze. The child's attention could have easily drawn the suspicion of patrolling soldiers. Jean carefully diverted the child's attention, offering a small gesture of reassurance, while inwardly reminding himself of the precariousness of their situation. In this world, even innocence could become a threat if misunderstood. By the end of summer, Jean's understanding of survival, courage, and human behavior had deepened profoundly. Life under occupation demanded not only physical endurance but psychological resilience, careful judgment, and moral clarity. Every day presented new challenges, from managing the children's safety to navigating the risks posed by neighbors, patrols, and informants. Yet amid the tension, there remained moments of quiet humanity. A neighbor leaving fresh bread on a doorstep, a whispered warning about a patrol, or the fleeting laughter of children playing cautiously in alleyways. These small signs of life were both fragile and vital, reinforcing the truth that even under the harshest oppression, ordinary people could act with bravery, compassion, and creativity. Jean realized that the occupation was a continuous test, not merely of courage, but of observation, adaptability, and the capacity to maintain humanity in the shadow of fear. Each day offered choices that could protect or endanger, and each choice carried consequences that rippled through the fragile web of survival. And as the sun set on the long days of summer, Jean felt the quiet determination that would carry him forward. The knowledge that ordinary people, through quiet courage and deliberate action, could endure, resist, and preserve hope even in the darkest times. As the late summer sun climbed higher in the sky, the town sweltered under an unrelenting heat wave. The oppressive warmth seemed to amplify the tension already woven into every street and alley. Life under occupation was exhausting enough in ordinary weather, but the heat introduced new challenges, testing the endurance, patience, and focus of Jean, Marie, and the entire resistance network. Rations, already minimal, became even harder to manage. Water sources, shared among neighbors and carefully guarded for both survival and resistance activities, grew scarce. Jean had to plan every trip with precision, calculating not only routes and timing to avoid patrols, but also ensuring sufficient hydration for himself, the couriers, and the families in hiding. The heat made every movement more arduous, every misstep potentially fatal. Sweat-soaked clothes, roads shimmered with heat, and the forest paths became more treacherous as dried leaves and loose soil threatened to betray footsteps. Amid this oppressive climate, unexpected encounters began to disrupt the carefully balanced routines. One morning, as Jean moved supplies along a lesser-used path near the river, he came across a young man crouched behind a tree. The stranger appeared frightened and exhausted, speaking hurriedly in whispers, insisting he had vital information about German movements and a potential safe route for relocating several families. Jean's instincts immediately heightened. The arrival of an unknown individual carried enormous risk, but the information could prove crucial. Carefully, Jean led the young man to a hidden clearing and questioned him, probing for inconsistencies, signs of deception, and potential danger. The man's story checked out. He had observed a detachment of German soldiers patrolling roads previously thought safe, and he offered advice on alternative routes through the forest. Jean realized that the network could not afford to ignore the warning, yet the new variable also introduced uncertainty. Trust, he understood, had to be earned cautiously, tested through observation and verification before any operational reliance could be placed upon it. The presence of the young man also reminded Jean of the constant human dimension of survival under occupation. Ordinary citizens, even those previously unknown to the network, sometimes emerged as unexpected allies. Their courage, initiative, and willingness to risk exposure added layers of both opportunity and danger. Jean had to balance this delicate equation, weighing the potential benefits against the ever-present threat of betrayal or error. Meanwhile, the heat wave brought another layer of tension. Illness, dehydration, heat exhaustion, and simple fatigue became real threats, particularly for couriers navigating long paths in the sun and families confined to cramped homes with limited airflow. Jean and Marie took measures to mitigate these risks, ensuring that water, shade, and rest periods were incorporated into every movement. Every precaution was critical. A momentary lapse could jeopardize not only the immediate mission but also the broader network. One afternoon, as Jean returned from a particularly grueling delivery, he encountered Elise and Luke near the market. Despite the heat, the children had ventured outside to fetch a small package of rations. Jean's heart pounded with fear and relief simultaneously. He scolded them gently but firmly, reinforcing the lesson that safety under occupation demanded constant awareness and restraint. In a world already fraught with danger, even the innocence of children required guidance and protection. The summer heat also seemed to sharpen the Germans' vigilance. Patrols moved more frequently, perhaps seeking to exploit exhaustion or distraction among the townspeople. Officers stationed near key points, such as bridges and marketplaces, monitored movement with an intensity that left Jean no room for error. Each step, each exchange, each handoff was scrutinized, forcing the network to adapt continually. Routes were modified, meeting points shifted, and the timing of deliveries adjusted to avoid detection. The fluidity of the network was essential, yet exhausting, demanding constant vigilance and calculation. Amid these operational challenges, the network's successes became a source of quiet resilience. Families in hiding received food, messages were delivered, and information about German movements was relayed promptly. Each successful operation reinforced the understanding that ordinary people, despite fear, scarcity, and oppressive surveillance, could achieve extraordinary outcomes through coordination, planning, and courage. The heat wave, relentless and unyielding, became a metaphor for life under occupation. Oppressive, exhausting, yet navigable through careful preparation and resilience. Jean realized that even in moments of extreme discomfort, vigilance, resourcefulness, and subtle human connection could sustain both life and hope. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, Jean paused on a hill to observe the quiet streets. He reflected on the network's perseverance, the courage of unknown allies, and the delicate balance of trust, risk, and strategy that defined life under occupation. The heat wave would pass, as would the long days of summer, but the lessons it imparted about endurance, observation, and the value of even small acts of courage would remain, shaping every step Gene and his network would take in the months to come. As the summer heat lingered, the town seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of unease. The streets, quiet and sun-bleached during the day, became almost spectral at dusk, when shadows stretched long across cobblestones and alleyways. Gene moved cautiously, aware that every shadow might conceal a watchful German soldier or an observant collaborator. The ordinary rhythms of town life now carried layers of hidden meaning, and the smallest gestures could betray months of careful planning. In recent weeks, suspicion had begun to pervade even the most familiar areas. Neighbors whispered behind curtains, glances lingered in the marketplace, and minor disputes seemed charged with unspoken tension. Gene realized that fear had a way of infiltrating ordinary life, shaping behavior in subtle yet profound ways. Trust had to be constantly assessed, loyalty verified, and routines adapted to a constantly shifting landscape of risk. One evening, while moving a small delivery of food and coded notes, Gene noticed two figures standing near a narrow alleyway. Their posture, hesitant and cautious, suggested that they were watching the street, possibly observing him. Heart racing, Gene slowed his pace and allowed himself to become part of the shadows, blending with the dim light of the lanterns lining the street. The figures did not approach, but the encounter left him acutely aware that surveillance could be closer than expected, and that the network's operations were under continuous scrutiny. Back at home, Gene and Marie convened a quiet council with trusted members of the network. The conversation was low, deliberate, and tense. Reports had surfaced of a potential informant, someone new to the area who had been asking unusually detailed questions about the layout of homes, the timing of deliveries, and the movements of children. The group devised strategies to mitigate the risk, including temporary suspension of non-essential deliveries, changes in coded messages, and careful observation of anyone unfamiliar in the neighborhood. The presence of an unknown observer heightened the stakes. Gene reflected on how vulnerability had become a constant companion under occupation. Every step outside, every interaction with neighbors, and even the sound of children playing carried the potential for discovery. Yet, despite the fear, he understood that hesitation could be just as dangerous as recklessness. Survival required careful judgment, decisiveness, and the ability to navigate uncertainty without succumbing to panic. The children, Elise and Luke, had become increasingly perceptive. They noticed changes in routine, observed their parents' heightened caution, and began to anticipate potential dangers. Gene and Marie reinforced lessons about discretion, teaching them subtle ways to move, watch, and communicate without revealing too much. Even in play, the children were learning survival skills, gaining awareness that could one day protect not only themselves but others in the network. Meanwhile, the forest paths, lifelines for couriers, had grown more perilous. German patrols, likely informed by recent observations, had begun to move unpredictably, sometimes splitting into smaller groups or patrolling at unexpected hours. Gene adapted, memorizing alternative routes, using natural landmarks to guide movement, and teaching couriers how to blend with the environment. Each successful navigation reinforced confidence, yet each close encounter reminded everyone that danger was never far away. Despite the pressure, acts of solidarity persisted. Villagers discreetly passed messages, shared resources, and offered subtle guidance to avoid patrols. Each small gesture, though seemingly insignificant, became part of the invisible network sustaining life under occupation. Gene increasingly recognized that courage was not always loud or dramatic. It often lived in quiet acts, performed without expectation of reward, yet carrying profound consequences for the survival of many. Rumors of betrayal, though unconfirmed, circulated like a persistent shadow, Jean and other trusted members were vigilant, assessing every interaction, analyzing behavior for inconsistencies, and reevaluating the reliability of even familiar neighbors. Trust was a fragile commodity, continuously tested, and the consequences of misjudgment could ripple through the community, endangering families, couriers, and hidden supplies. By late summer, the town had transformed into a landscape of vigilance and subtle strategy. Shadows and alleyways were no longer mere darkness. They were a constant reminder of observation, both friendly and hostile. The network adapted, survived, and sometimes even thrived, yet the tension of hidden threats persisted, shaping every decision and every movement. Jean understood that the delicate balance of survival demanded not only courage but patience, ingenuity, and unwavering attention to the smallest details. As the sun sank behind rooftops, casting long, eerie shadows across the streets, Jean paused for a moment on a quiet corner. He observed the town with a mixture of apprehension and resolve, knowing that each day carried the weight of life and death, loyalty and betrayal, fear and courage. And even in the darkest corners, he found a glimmer of hope, the quiet determination of ordinary people, moving cautiously, acting bravely, and sustaining the fragile yet enduring web of resistance that kept their community alive. As summer waned and the air cooled slightly, a new layer of tension descended upon the town. Strangers began appearing along the edges of the village. Travelers, merchants, and displaced families, each bringing with them an air of uncertainty. Jean watched them carefully from his window and from hidden vantage points, noting their movements, mannerisms, and interactions. Every newcomer carried potential, either an opportunity to expand the network of resistance or a dangerous risk of exposure. The arrival of outsiders quickly gave rise to rumors. Whispers circulated about soldiers disguised as civilians, about collaborators moving freely under the guise of merchants, and about families who had been quietly removed or disappeared. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, spread rapidly, infecting conversations in markets, laundries, and back alleys. Fear multiplied with each retelling, transforming ordinary exchanges into exercises in caution and mistrust. Jean recognized immediately that rumor itself had become a weapon, shaping behavior, creating hesitation, and occasionally providing cover for the network's activities. One afternoon, as Jean made his way through a familiar alley carrying a small package of supplies, he noticed a young woman standing near a fountain, speaking in hushed tones with an older man. Their posture, gestures, and the intensity of their conversation suggested that they were not ordinary townsfolk. Jean slowed, assessing the situation from the shadows. Was this an ordinary exchange? Or were these strangers scouting the town, perhaps sent to uncover networks like his own? He could not risk assumptions. Each judgment had to be informed by observation, experience, and a careful reading of subtle cues. Back at home, Marie expressed her own concerns. She worried not only about the strangers but about the children, Elise and Luke, who had begun to notice the arrival of outsiders. Their curiosity was natural, but in this environment, curiosity could become dangerous. The children were instructed to observe quietly, to report nothing, and to understand that safety often required secrecy, patience, and restraint. The lesson was subtle yet vital. Survival under occupation demanded the ability to discern between ordinary life and hidden threats. The network responded to the new uncertainty with careful adaptation. Routes for courier deliveries were further altered, new codes were introduced, and surveillance of the town increased. Jean himself took to patrolling less obvious paths, observing both newcomers and familiar faces to ensure that the network's operations could continue undetected. The presence of strangers amplified the stakes. Every movement had to be deliberate, every interaction measured, and every observation recorded mentally for later analysis. One evening, a small group of newcomers arrived at the edge of the forest near the town. Jean observed them from a hidden perch, noting their cautious approach, the way they whispered to each other, and the supplies they carried. It became clear that some of them were fleeing from areas more heavily controlled, seeking refuge in the relative obscurity of the village. While this offered opportunities to discreetly expand the network, it also carried enormous risk. Unknown individuals could inadvertently reveal paths, drop points, or safe houses if observed by German patrols. Meanwhile, the rumor mill continued its work. A local baker claimed to have overheard soldiers discussing secret supply drops, while another villager suggested that some families were planning to leave the town entirely under cover of night. Each piece of information, fragmentary and sometimes unreliable, required careful consideration. Jean realized that rumors could be both dangerous and useful. They could mislead occupiers or alert the network to unseen threats, depending on how they were interpreted and acted upon. As the days passed, the town seemed to exist in two overlapping realities. On the surface, life appeared normal. Merchants sold bread, children played cautiously in alleyways, and neighbors exchanged polite greetings. Beneath this facade, however, the invisible network of observation, coded messages, and subtle acts of defiance continued to operate, responding dynamically to every new challenge. Jean and Marie had become adept at navigating these layers, maintaining vigilance without succumbing to paranoia, and teaching their children to do the same. By the end of the month, the arrival of strangers had reshaped the town's social landscape. Fear, curiosity, and suspicion were intertwined, influencing every decision and interaction. Jean recognized that survival depended not only on courage and secrecy, but also on discernment. The ability to read people, anticipate threats, and adapt strategies with intelligence and precision. In this ever-shifting environment, ordinary citizens could perform extraordinary acts, sustaining both life and hope even in the face of constant danger. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets and alleys, Jean paused to watch the newcomers settle into the edges of the town. Their presence was a reminder that life under occupation was never static. Threats evolved, opportunities emerged, and survival required constant awareness, courage, and quiet determination. Autumn began to settle over the town, and with it came a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The oppressive heat had faded, replaced by cooler mornings and the scent of fallen leaves. But life under occupation remained as tense and unpredictable as ever. Jean had learned to read these changes not merely as seasonal transitions, but as cues that shaped strategy, timing, and movement. The network's operations continued, but the growing presence of strangers and the ever-watchful eyes of German patrols added layers of risk that demanded constant vigilance. One evening, Jean noticed a familiar face lingering near one of the alleyway drop points. A neighbor who had previously been deemed trustworthy, now appearing unusually hesitant and distracted. The sight raised an immediate alarm in Jean's mind. Trust was fragile, he reminded himself, and betrayal often arrived quietly, without warning. A single misstep could expose weeks of planning, jeopardize lives, and unravel the delicate threads that kept the network intact. The next day, a coded message brought confirmation of the growing threat. An unknown individual had been spotted observing supply routes, memorizing routines, and questioning neighbors under the guise of casual conversation. The network faced a stark choice: continue as usual, risking exposure, or implement temporary disruptions to operations while verifying loyalty and intentions. Jean convened a discreet meeting with trusted members, analyzing each observation, rumor, and encounter with meticulous care. Every decision now carried weight far beyond immediate convenience. The lives of families, couriers, and even the children depended upon judgment executed without hesitation. The network's response was multifaceted. Drop points were rotated more frequently, new coded signals were introduced, and patrols of the network itself were intensified. Couriers were given alternative routes, and additional observation points were designated to detect suspicious behavior before it could escalate into direct threats. Jean understood that survival depended not only on physical skill or courage, but also on anticipation, calculation, and the ability to interpret human behavior with precision. Meanwhile, tension within the household subtly intensified. Elise and Luke, though young, were perceptive enough to notice the seriousness in their parents' actions. Small gestures, whispered conversations, and altered routines signaled that danger was ever present. Jean and Marie worked to maintain normalcy, teaching lessons, preparing meals, and offering moments of play, yet every action carried layers of meaning, a practice in vigilance disguised as routine. Even the children's curiosity had to be tempered, for innocent questions could inadvertently reveal information to those watching. The risk of betrayal also extended beyond strangers. Jean became increasingly aware that fear itself could corrode loyalty. Individuals who had once acted bravely and discreetly began to hesitate, driven by self-preservation, exhaustion, or subtle coercion. The network had to navigate these delicate dynamics with care, reinforcing trust, providing guidance, and ensuring that every member understood the consequences of missteps without instilling panic. The balance between encouragement and vigilance was precarious, yet essential for continued operations. One afternoon, Jean observed an unexpected act of courage that highlighted the complex interplay of risk and morality. A neighbor, previously hesitant to participate, discreetly delivered a message across town, braving the uncertainty of patrols and observation. Though a small gesture in isolation, it reinforced the network's understanding that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary acts when necessity and conscience demanded it. Each act of bravery, however subtle, became a vital thread sustaining life, morale, and hope. Rumors of betrayal continued to circulate, often indistinguishable from fact. Some claimed that a local shopkeeper had revealed hidden movements to the Germans. Others suggested that certain families had been coerced into revealing routes. Jean learned to treat these stories cautiously, verifying details through observation, cross-checking accounts, and introducing controlled tests to assess reliability. In this world, discernment was as critical as courage. By late autumn, the town had transformed into a carefully maintained web of observation, coded communication, and strategic adaptation. Every step taken by Jean, Marie, and their fellow resistance members was calculated to preserve both secrecy and efficiency. Betrayal, whether real or imagined, remained a constant shadow, yet the network endured through intelligence, patience, and the quiet determination to act for the greater good. And even amidst this web of suspicion, there were moments of unexpected humanity. A neighbor quietly sharing food despite fear of discovery, a child safely guided past an officer, a message successfully delivered that preserved the safety of families in hiding. These acts reminded Jean that ordinary people, acting with courage and discretion, could maintain a fragile but enduring sense of life, hope, and dignity, even under the weight of constant danger. As autumn deepened, the once golden fields transformed into muted tones of brown and amber. The days shortened, shadows lengthened, and the crispness in the air reminded Jean and the town's residents that winter would soon arrive. For ordinary people living under occupation, the changing seasons were not merely a backdrop. They shaped movement, strategy, and the very rhythm of survival. Cold nights forced families into tighter quarters, supply lines became harder to maintain, and the German presence seemed ever more oppressive, as patrols adjusted to the new visibility conditions and early darkness. Jean felt the shift acutely, The network's operations had always required precision, but now, as dusk arrived sooner and the forest paths became slick with early frost, every step demanded more calculation. Couriers needed extra clothing, additional rations, and meticulous awareness of environmental hazards that could reveal their presence. The interplay between nature and occupation created a new layer of risk, and Jean's mind, already attuned to human threats, now had to account for wind, frost, and the way snow or leaves could betray footsteps. The urgency of operations increased as well. Rumors of German crackdowns circulated. Officers had reportedly begun interrogating families near neighboring villages, seeking hidden networks, collaborators, or supplies. Jean realized that inaction could no longer be an option. The network had to act decisively, reinforcing safe routes, relocating families if necessary, and ensuring that coded messages reached their intended recipients without delay. Hesitation could lead to disaster, and every decision carried weight. Meanwhile, the townspeople exhibited a quiet resilience that both inspired and worried Jean. Ordinary acts, like sharing fuel for heating, secretly moving provisions, or discreetly guiding children past patrols, became more critical than ever. These gestures, often unnoticed by outsiders, sustained the delicate balance between survival and exposure. Jean understood that life under occupation was a constant negotiation. Every movement, every word, every glance carried hidden meaning, and ordinary courage became a daily necessity. The changing season also brought unexpected encounters. One evening, while traversing a narrow lane to deliver a message, Jean noticed an older man, unfamiliar to him, watching from a window. His gaze lingered, calculating and quiet, and Jean's instincts immediately went on alert. Was the man simply curious, or had he observed enough to pose a threat? Jean adjusted his pace, used shadows for cover, and observed the man's reaction as he passed. The encounter ended without confrontation, yet the sense of observation lingered, reinforcing the fragile nature of secrecy in an occupied town. At home, Marie worked tirelessly to maintain a semblance of warmth and normalcy despite the growing cold and scarcity. The children, Elise and Luke, learned to layer clothing, keep close to the hearth, and follow their parents' subtle instructions regarding safety. Life had become a constant balance between ordinary domestic routine and survival under constant threat. Even as the wind whistled through the streets and frost crept along the window panes, the household maintained vigilance, understanding that comfort was a luxury that could never override the need for caution. The network itself evolved in response to the seasonal pressures. Drop points shifted indoors, messages were hidden in firewood or beneath floorboards, and couriers adjusted their schedules to take advantage of early mornings when the streets were quietest. Jean observed that adaptability had become as essential as courage. The ability to pivot, improvise, and anticipate both environmental and human factors was critical to survival. Every success reinforced the network's understanding that ordinary people, through careful observation and decisive action, could navigate even the most oppressive circumstances. The winter's approach also heightened the psychological tension. Fear of exposure, worry for family, and uncertainty about allies and strangers alike became ever more present. Yet amidst the tension, there were small reminders of hope. A neighbor discreetly delivering extra blankets, the quiet laughter of children despite the cold, or the successful movement of supplies that ensured another family remained protected. These moments reinforced Jean's belief that perseverance, intelligence, and subtle acts of courage could sustain life and dignity, even under occupation. As the final leaves fell and the first frost coated the streets, Jean paused atop a familiar hill, observing the village below. Shadows stretched long and cold, and the once familiar alleys seemed transformed under the weight of both season and occupation. Yet in the midst of uncertainty, He found a quiet determination that ordinary people, guided by vigilance, courage, and subtle intelligence, could endure, adapt, and preserve hope even as the seasons changed and the challenges of occupation deepened.